gentlemen, inside the Borg and free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear hosting Leak Project. The Leak Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leak Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain-drained media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth. Programs, the Babylonian Banksters, and Alchemy of Money. Towards the end of the program, we will be discussing the transhuman movement and how that will affect our future society. You can find out more about Joseph's works at www.gizadeathstar.com. His books are also available on Amazon. So kick back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Mr. Farrell, it's great to have you on the show tonight with us. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on, Rex.
Yeah, it's great to have you on here with us. I had somebody a while ago that emailed me and asked if I could get you on the show. I've had the opportunity to read through some of your books. I went to your Amazon page. You've got just a huge following. And when I went through the reviews, 99% of the people that have read your books are just enthralled with what you have to say. That 1%, you can't please everybody. So, but I'd like to ask you, first of all, I'm a big fan of Sioux Falls. South Dakota is just an amazing state. I love the Black Hills, the Badlands, just a great place to go visit. But you know, with an education from Oxford University, that's such a highly acclaimed college, just amazing. You must have got just incredible grades through school. But what got you into this path with the research that you get into, Joseph?
Oh boy. Well, I've always been interested in strange stuff, to be quite honest with you. I guess in school, I was always kind of the enfant terrible. I was the kid asking all the wrong questions all the time, and never really satisfied, with giving the academic regurgitation answer. And I've always been interested in ancient civilizations and stuff. My father was an engineer, and some of their very good friends in town. We had friends. The husband was the engineer at the local CBS television station affiliate, Kelloland, KELO in Sioux Falls. He actually had built from hand the color transmitter for the television station. That was the kind of guy he was. So
very cool.
Yeah, very cool. So I grew up in a family of nerds with nerds for friends, and that kind of explains how I got started in all this.
Nice. Now, I mean, you've got probably well over 20 years into research involved in the topics that we're going to discuss. And when I read your book, the Breakaway Societies, at the very beginning, it's funny because a lot of the questions that you say people are going to ask were the first things that came into my mind. And what I wanted to get into first, if we could, is the breakaway civilizations that you write about and discuss. Who's a part of it? How many secret civilizations are there?
Well, by the term breakaway civilization, that is actually a term that was coined by the well-known UFO researcher Richard Dolan. He wrote a 2-volume study called UFOs in the National Security State, which, as far as I'm concerned, are really the Bible. If you want to get into the study of UFOs, of the government reaction to them, those are very carefully researched from the documents, from personal testimony, and so on. They're just mammoth volumes, well footnoted. I'm an academic, so I live for footnotes. But it's his term, and what he meant by it was largely that as a response to the UFO phenomenon, the United States national security establishment basically may have come up over the years with such extraordinary technologies that in effect, and the infrastructure to create them, that in effect what we might be dealing with on Earth is a whole hidden underground sort of infrastructure or civilization, if you will, that has pulled so far ahead of the public civilization that we see, that in effect we're dealing with a group of people that have an entirely different decision-taking process, an entirely different kind of culture, things that they can access or have access to. Now, I've taken that term and run with it, and with some of his insights in the following way, because in those covert civilizations and breakaway civilizations, or covert civilizations and covert wars series, I forget the exact titles to my own books. In those,
well, you have written a lot of them.
Yeah, it's almost 24 now, approaching 24. In those books, what I do essentially is I outline a case that I've been building through many books regarding the relationship between post-war Nazism, the American national security state, and so on. And I've come to the following conclusions. Firstly, after World War II, the American national security establishment is essentially confronted with three strategic problems that it has. Number one, the communist bloc, very obviously. Number two, it's confronted with what I've been arguing is essentially a post-war extraterritorial Nazi state. It's an extraterritorial organization that's well funded. It has its own kind of command structure. It has its own kind of intelligence structure. It certainly is engaged in covert operations of one sort or another after the war, ostensibly in many cases for the CIA. But when you dig into some of these operations, they're well-known historical events, you find that these Nazis are behaving very independently of their so-called American masters. Plus you have, of course, the presence in this country of a great deal of paperclip, Operation Paperclip Nazis that were brought over here to kind of jumpstart America's space program. So you have the awareness of the national security state, of this structure, and of, in certain cases, its interference with American goals and objectives and defense installations and so on. So this becomes a national security matter for them, because the real question here is, where are these folks based, and what are they up to? And then the third strategic problem, obviously, that the national security establishment has after the war is the UFO, which of course constitutes the most potential threat that they've got to deal with. So I've also argued that as a result of these three things, what they put into place was a completely hidden system of finance. And please understand what I mean here. I'm not talking about the black budget. I'm not talking about those items of finance that Congress votes and essentially turns over to the intelligence military industrial complex to do whatever they want to do with. I'm talking about a system that is entirely off the books and entirely free of congressional oversight. Now, this system was put into place by President Truman in 1947. I believe it was October or November of 1947. And the system is based on the top secret recovery of Axis loot, primarily of Japanese loot that was plundered from Asia and then buried all over the Philippine Islands, Luzon, Mindanao, and so on, prior to the end of the war. This was made known to him. It was first came to the attention of Captain Ed Lansdale, who's probably a figure that many of your people are familiar with. Ed Lansdale was a captain in the U.S. Army, and he became familiar with the existence of all of this loot as he was in the Philippines as a U.S. Army intelligence officer. He then went to General MacArthur and briefed him on all of this loot existing in the Philippines. MacArthur then sent him to President Truman directly to brief President Truman. So this is a very important point, because President Truman at this juncture decides to proceed with the recovery of all of this Axis loot and to keep it top secret. In other words, we're not going to return it to any claimants that the Japanese may have stolen it from. We're going to use it as a system of finance to fund covert projects and black research projects. And this was a decision he took in 1947, and he turned all of this over to the National Security Council. And it's very important for people here to understand what this means, because the amount of loot that was ultimately made available is probably in the billions of dollars. We don't know exactly how much there was. And this means that he's putting the intelligence agencies directly into the banking business. And this, of course, means that it's going to require the participation of certain prime banks in this system. But what you've effectively done is you've set up a hidden slush fund without any oversight whatsoever from Congress or anybody else to fund all of these black projects, to fund all of these covert operations. Now, as I've put it in other interviews that I've given on this topic over the years, there's another aspect of this that this means, and this means that you're going at some point to have the cooperation of the former Axis elites themselves in order to find all of this money, recover it, and make use of it. So there quite literally is a Faustian deal with the devil, if you will, towards the end of World War II that's made to put into place this operation. And we've seen other indications that there's something like this hidden system of finance in existence. And the details, we could go into the details if you want to, but I'm one of these people that can talk forever if you let me. So I'll shut up.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. This is great. And Joseph, there's so many things that I see today when you look at all the different symbols and sigils that are out there. A lot of them relate to what was around in the Nazi times, and it just seems like we're more of Rome. We take all the good from these. When I say we, I'm referring to America. It takes the great stuff from all these different cultures and brings it into its own and kind of adopts it. But, there's a lot of speculation that some of these flying saucers that people saw in the 40s and such were actually from Nazi technology and not extraterrestrials. What's your information on the Nazi tech that they had even back in the 30s, and where did they get it?
Well, this is a question I get asked a lot, and it's such a huge story. I've written probably close to uh, a dozen books by now that touch in one way or another on this aspect of Nazi technology. And the reason for so many books, folks, is that it's such a huge story. There's so much misinformation out there. The details of the story, once you get into it, are so fantastic that if I were to write it up as a Hollywood B movie, people would easily dismiss it as fiction. And this is the reason I insist on footnoting things and arguing very carefully off the evidence, because it is a fantastic story. The Nazis, in my opinion, you hear all of these stories on the internet about the Hanabu flying saucer, the Vril flying saucer, and so on and so forth. There's a group of people out there that think that the Nazis actually achieved some sort of field propulsion or anti-gravity flying saucer. I am not in that crowd. Let me make that very clear. And the reason why is that most of these stories are coming out of a narrow circle of people, again, this post-war Nazi international, that were clustered in and around Vienna, Austria, and Munich, Germany after the war. And they would publish photographs and so on, alleged plans and so on of these devices. The reality is that the Nazis were working on an exotic technology like this. And I've gone at great lengths in my books on the story of the so-called Nazi bell. This is the story that basically formed the centerpiece of the Jane's Defense Weekly journalist Nick Cook's book called The Hunt for Zero Point that appeared right around the turn of the millennium. It was a bestseller, incidentally. If you don't know the book, I highly recommend you read it. I kind of take off from him. He takes off from another researcher by the name of Igor Witkowski that first broke this story in Poland after the downfall of the Warsaw Pact and the demise of the Iron Curtain by going in and examining old documents, stories, interviewing witnesses, and installations in the former eastern zone of Germany. Essentially, what the Nazis were working on with this device, with this technology, I think was threefold. They were, first of all, looking for a form of what we would now call free energy or zero-point energy or what have you. The second thing they were working on is obviously if you have a technology that can access by some means the energy of the vacuum flux or the zero-point energy, if you can successfully learn how to manipulate that flux through a technological means, then the potential exists for you to have an anti-gravity technology, to be sure. And then the third thing, of course, is that if you have a technology that allows you to manipulate the vacuum flux or the fabric of space-time, whatever you want to call it, on the laboratory bench, then this ultimately has a weaponization potential that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So, the Nazis being Nazis, they're going to research all of this stuff. So they're essentially creating a technology, I think, with this Bell device that is a gateway technology. They're experimenting on whether or not it is possible to do this, number one. And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the answers from Witkowski's research, if you accept them for the sake of argument, is that yes, they achieve some sort of rudimentary ability to do this. Now, this device, just to give you a couple of details about this Bell device, it reportedly was seen at night by the local concentration camp inmates that would see something resembling a barrel or a bell glowing in a pale glue light floating above the tree line at night where this device was being tested. But that's all it would do. It would levitate, and that's about it. In other words, it's not a UFO. It's not a flying saucer darting around the skies, but it is an astonishing technology because all of this allegedly is being done by some very sophisticated electromagnetic and plasma technology. We can get into the details perhaps tonight, or we can get into the details about this device in a subsequent interview if you wish. But essentially, what the eyewitnesses are saying is forget about the idea of the Nazis constructing a field propulsion flying saucer with pilots in it, zipping around the skies and performing careful maneuvers. This is not true. This is something very different.
Now,
Now, go
I just
ahead.
want to jump in here real quick. There's a lot of speculation, or I mean, not even speculation, but there's a lot of research that points to many Nazi officers and people at very high levels in the Reich would do these seances and summon
Hmm.
up these, what they would call interstellar entities to get
Yes.
certain knowledge and technology. Have you got research notes and knowledge on that?
Well, I do mention it in a book of mine about this whole exotic technological pursuit of theirs called the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. I do record the fact that there were attempts, apparently, in the interwar period, actually beginning in 1916, halfway through World War One, where there were attempts, apparently, by various scientists and psychics and so on to contact the other realms. And the story goes that one of these psychics, her name is Maria Orsic, actually did channel something from supposedly some of this contact, which the story goes she then proceeds to write down in automatic writing in the form of Sumerian cuneograms. So take that for whatever it's worth. I certainly don't base any of my arguments or conclusions on that story, but it's worth mentioning and putting out there. It is true that you had a huge Nazi interest in the esoteric and in the occult, and indeed Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer of the SS, establishes a department of the SS called the Ahnenerbendienst, which essentially was the SS secret archaeological society. Peter Levenda calls it a humanities program with guns. I think that's probably the best way to put it. This group of SS scientists and archaeologists are the people going all over the world looking for very strange stuff, esoteric lore, ancient sites and so on. And the whole purpose of this, as Heinrich Himmler put it in his degree establishing this branch of the SS, was for the purpose of its potential military application. So in other words, the Nazi regime is just really throwing the book right out the window and is saying that we're willing to pursue any avenue, howsoever out of the box it might be, toward the acquisition of technological superiority over our potential enemies. So I think you have to factor this into some of these things. But in actual fact, I think the inspiration, and again, I'm apologizing for going around Harvey's barn here. I do that quite a lot. So, jump in and keep me on course. But I think the real inspiration for these types of projects, and particularly for the Bell, can be rationalized by a close examination of some of the papers that appeared in between the wars in the German physics and mathematics journals, and for that matter in other places in Europe as well. I think there's a clear argument that you don't need to go to crashed flying saucers or extraterrestrials or secret society influence to see a very clear provenance for some of these ideas, at least in scientific terms, inside of Nazi Germany.
Well, and if you look at these advanced societies, technologies that they've created, I mean, how far advanced is some of this stuff?
Well, the Bell itself would have been a very, very advanced project from a number of points of view. In my opinion, this is a device that was really kind of inspired to test aspects of unified field theories that were being bandied about, principally in Germany, we might add, in between the wars. But there's a signal event that occurs in 1935. I discuss this in my book called Secrets of the Unified Field. There's a Hungarian electrical engineering genius, a fellow by the name of Gabriel Krohn, he happens to be a Hungarian Jew, that wrote a paper in the year 1935 about the application of tensor calculus to the study of anomalies, and particularly the phenomenon of phase creep within rotating networked electrical systems. Okay, now that sounds like it's horribly technical, and of course tensor calculus is horribly technical. It's the kind of mathematics that Albert Einstein used in his general theory of relativity. All right, so that's tensor calculus, and that's its normal application. In other words, if you study mathematical physics, you're most likely going to run into this mathematical language when you study general relativity. All right. But what Krohn is doing, what he's really saying here, and this is very crucial for people to latch onto, Krohn is saying that you can take all of this hyperdimensional mathematics, and that's what it is, and bring it right down as a laboratory to the laboratory bench as a means of explaining phenomena that electrical engineers that deal with large, powerful, rotating electrical systems notice. So in other words, what Krohn is saying from the engineering standpoint rather than the scientific one is that, yes, we have a means for actually engineering with 1935 electrical technology. We have the means of engineering a connection between electromagnetism and gravity. That's essentially what he's telling you. And when he publishes this paper, it wins him a prize. It wins him the Montefiore Prize at the University of Liège in Belgium. And it's very interesting to me to note that as a consequence of this, almost immediately, just across the border inside of Nazi Germany, all public discussion of unified field theories, which had been going on in Germany in the interwar period and even for a brief period of time after the Nazis took power, all public discussion of unified field theories absolutely shut up. It was absolutely silenced. In other words, I think the regime just immediately classified all discussion like this top secret and put it into their black projects world. And I think this is ultimately where you see the Bell Project getting its Nazi funding and so on and so forth, although I think the concepts were out there long before the Nazis took power. And I've even suggested that maybe the project secretly began as a secret project under the Weimar Republic, and the Nazis simply came in and took it over. Krohn himself, it's interesting to note where he ends up. He ends up in the United States of America working for General Electric in Schenectady, New York, up until the time of his death, and he's more or less the theoretical guru for General Electric. So in other words, he has his hands into a lot of American black projects in one form or another. And he wrote some just incredible treatises on the applications of tensor calculus to electrical systems, just phenomenal stuff. So basically, yeah, I think this is where we have to look when we're looking at all of these Nazi exotic technologies having to deal with electromagnetism, with nuclear plasmas, and so on and so forth. I think we have to look to the paper trail in the physics and scientific and engineering literature in between the wars.
Now, I remember a couple years ago, I read some white papers that were on the FBI.gov/vaults website that
Right.
talked about how Hitler had actually escaped
Yeah.
via submarine and into Argentina. So do you think there's any truth to that?
Absolutely. In fact, in the course, I got to tell you, Rex, in the course of examining this whole Nazi international thesis, I began years ago with accepting the standard explanation that Hitler had committed suicide in the bunker in the final days of the war. After looking at this whole story, I've come to a complete reversal of that position. I do think that he made it out of Nazi Germany. Peter Levenda, many people, Jerome Corsi. There have been many people that have researched aspects of Hitler's escape and how it might have been done. And I'm not saying my method is the only way that he could have got out. I'm simply connecting it to other parts and aspects of this story that I think most people are, when they read these things, they're truly shocked at how different the actual history may have been from the public history. In my version of the story, let me try and give you the quick Cliff Notes version of it. And I lay this out in yet another book of mine called The Nazi International. In my version of the story, the first thing that we have to assume for the sake of argument is that the Nazis successfully tested an atom bomb in or around October of 1944. And I lay all the evidence for that out in the first book that I did in this Nazi series called Reich of the Black Sun, because it's crucial to understand that the atom bomb was not at the pinnacle of the Nazi black research project's world. In other words, they didn't view it as the ultimate war-winning decisive technology. So that tells you just how exotic the stuff may have been that they were working on, if that was not their high priority. But nevertheless, I think they successfully tested one in October of 1944. Now, with that in mind, let's look carefully at what this means. It means, first of all, that in terms of the infrastructure they would have needed to create the bomb, They would have needed, first of all, massive uranium enrichment technologies and facilities for enriching uranium. And please note here, it's not necessary for the project or the program to have the ability to make plutonium in a reactor. You don't need to make plutonium. Plutonium just gives you more bang for the buck, so to speak, when you're making A bombs. You can make a uranium-based bomb. And this, I believe, was actually the hidden purpose of Auschwitz, and here's why. The German firm IG Farben, the huge chemicals cartel that we're all familiar with, built a synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz that was absolutely gymongous, to quote Art Bell's old word. It was huge. This plant consumed more electricity than the entire city of Berlin. It was staffed by a staff of about 10,000 German contract workers, plus, of course, slave labor from the local concentration camp. It cost and was built by IG Farben at their own expense for a tune of about 900 million Reichsmarks, which in today's dollars would translate to about $2.5 billion. So in other words, this plant is huge and is quite expensive. Yet we were told after the war by the Farben executives that in its entire 4-year period of operation, it produced not 1 ounce of synthetic rubber. Now, this is absurd on the face of it because Farben knew how to make synthetic rubber. The excuse they gave was that the plant was plagued by breakdowns and so on and so forth, which it was. But when you add it all together, that amount of electrical consumption, the amount of technicians need to run this, what it really looks like is it's a huge uranium enrichment plant. The Nazis, as we discovered at the end of the war, had also stockpiled tons of enriched uranium. And in 1945, a German U-boat is captured by the United States Navy. It's the U-234. And this is a significant part of this. It, indeed, is probably the linchpin of the story. Because, first of all, the United States had jammed British and Canadian radio traffic concerning this U-boat. Everybody was looking for it to prevent the British and the Canadians from getting their hands on the U-boat. We rendezvoused with the U-boat. We took it back to Portsmouth, Maine. We interred the crew, and the scientist that was on board, a fellow by the name of Dr. Heinz Schlicke, was taken to the Pentagon to brief some Pentagon brass under the chairmanship of a Mr. Alvarez. All right? This is what's in the record. Now, if you study the U-234 matter even more closely, it had 2 Japanese officers, when it departed Germany, painting labels that they were putting on these cylinders that were loaded into the U-boat. There were about 80 of these cylinders. And the labels said U-235. Okay, this is recorded by the U-boat's radio operator, a fellow by the name of Hirschfeld. They were supposed to take all this stuff to Germany. Well, it turns out that these 80 cylinders were in fact gold-lined cylinders and were carrying uranium-235 in yellow cake form. In other words, this is highly enriched uranium, and we know it's highly enriched simply because you use gold to store uranium that has been enriched. If you use lead to prevent neutron escape and so on, and accidental critical mass, happening, you don't use lead because lead is very corrosive with highly enriched uranium. You have to use a very stable metal that can easily absorb neutrons, and that's gold. So in other words, this is the clue right here, that we're not dealing, and please understand this, folks, we are not dealing with an incompetent nuclear project as we have been told. This is a clear clue that we're dealing with a huge project that has the technology to enrich uranium, which they were, and they're transferring all of this to Japan. However, for some odd reason, this U-boat is able to rendezvous with a U.S. Navy destroyer and be escorted to Portsmouth, where the lead scientist on the U-boat, Heinz Schlicke, is taken to the Pentagon, where he's briefing American brass under the chairmanship of a fellow by the name of Mr. Alvarez. All right. Well, guess what? Heinz Schlicke invented infrared proximity fuses. Okay, that's his invention. And this is the guy that's on the way to Japan with 25 functioning examples of his infrared fuses. And the Mr. Alvarez is in all likelihood a Dr. Luis Alvarez, who's working on the American Manhattan Bomb Project. And guess what he wins the Nobel Prize for? after the war. He wins the prize for solving the fusing problem for a plutonium bomb. Now, why is all of this coincidence significant? Well, a plutonium bomb is an implosion bomb. In other words, you've got a core of plutonium metal that's surrounded by explosives that has to be symmetrically compressed quickly and almost simultaneously, which will not occur by conventional wiring circuits. In other words, infrared proximity fuses are a pretty danged handy thing to have around when you're trying to make a plutonium atom bomb, okay? So in other words, when you add all this up, Rex, what it looks like is that somebody in Nazi Germany is turning over essential components to the atom bomb project of the United States, and in fact, components that, as it turns out, the United States needs in order to complete the project, namely the technology to fire off a plutonium bomb and 80 cylinders filled with kilograms of U-235, which is interesting also because if you research it, as I point out in my book, Reich of the Black Sun, if you research it, after the capture of this German U-boat, for some reason, the stocks of fissile uranium in the American atom bomb project double. Okay, so in other words, it's a clear indicator that we had feedstock of uranium into our uranium bomb from Nazi Germany. And on top of this, you can also go in and research the Manhattan Project records, and the metallurgists are reporting in December of 1944 that they won't have enough fissile uranium for a bomb at current rates of production until November of 1945. And of course, we dropped the uranium bomb on Hiroshima in August of 1945. So in other words, all the indicators are pointing that we're getting feedstock of technology, feedstock of actual fissile nuclear fuel for a bomb from this Nazi U-boat. And this means in turn that someone inside of Nazi Germany is turning it over to the Allies. And here's what I think happened. In the Nazi International, I deal with Martin Bormann, okay, the Amonas Grise behind Adolf Hitler. And in fact, the guy that's actually running the domestic interior policies and operations of the Third Reich throughout the World War, because Hitler, of course, is busy running the war end of things. It's Martin Bormann that's actually running the domestic end of things, all right? Bormann, I think, cut a deal via his SS contacts with American intelligence in Switzerland. That would be Alan Dulles, folks, okay? I think Bormann cut a very high-level secret deal with some aspects of the American intelligence and military complex, and put himself, he told the Allies that I'm going to turn over to you atomic bomb secrets. But what he didn't tell them, and he pointed out, this is going to be the submarine that it's on. Tell your British allies don't bomb or depth charge this thing as it's going through the Kattegat up to Norway on the way out into the Atlantic. What Bormann didn't tell his American friends was he was going to put himself on that U-boat with, and get himself out of Germany, and probably Hitler too, get them out of Germany under American protection, because we wanted the atomic bomb secrets that the Nazis had, because we were approaching the end of our financial tether trying to make the atomic bomb work. So I think this is what happened. I think he smuggled himself out on that U-boat. There's 12 days missing from the U-boat's log, which I think allowed them the time to get Bormann down to nationalist Spain, along with whoever else he may have had on that boat with him, maybe Hitler, maybe not. I think possibly Hitler was on board. They got them down to nationalist Spain. Then the boat was sent across the Atlantic, where all of this was fed into the American atomic bomb project.
Have you seen that TV series called Manhattan?
No, I don't watch that much TV. I simply don't have time.
Hey, no problem. There's just so many series out there now on TV that they're either portraying a false reality of what happened in the past, whether to make more money or to kind of condition the masses. But there's this series out there called Manhattan that talks about that whole project and what was done in New Mexico. But side note, let's don't get into that. Now, there's covert wars that you talk about, and
right.
There's so much stuff. Like, let's talk about right now what's going on, Joseph. Just a few months ago, there were those giant explosions that took place in China and that military base in Japan right after that. There's speculation that there's these covert wars going on with the U.S. and China, etc. Talk about that with us, if you would, please.
Well, I do think that's going on. I think in a certain sense that we are looking at an entirely new thing in the history of geopolitics, in that if we have a divided national security establishment where one part of it has gone so deeply black and cut itself off so thoroughly from any sort of government oversight. That in effect you're dealing with a hidden player on the scenes right now. I've thought this since 9/11. As a matter of fact, I think there's aspects of 9/11 that point to the indicator of a third player other than rogue elements within the United States apparatus, other than the alleged 19 terrorists that supposedly carried off all of this stuff, which is a story I've never bought. I think there's actually a third layer involved. So I do think it is possible that we are looking at an attempt by somebody to, not necessarily the United States, and please understand what I'm saying here. It could be the United States acting in a covert operations fashion behind some of these things, or it could be somebody else attempting to ratchet up tensions between the United States and China. I don't think we can rule that entirely out of the picture, given the fact that if you take what I've said previously about the possibility of the existence of a hidden system of finance in place since the end of World War II, and dealing, therefore, over the past few decades in trillions of dollars. Stop and think about what I've just said. What I've just said is you've created enough of a slush fund to fund an international organization with reach or fingers into the development of exotic technologies. You've created an international organization that could have an intelligence capability, which I certainly think it does, and that implies a covert operations capability. You're implying something that's out of control, that has cut itself free, essentially. And I think that the possibility does exist that you're looking at tensions like this being exacerbated by some hidden player. And let me give you another tidbit reason why I think this. I put this as an epigraph to the very first chapter of my most recent book on this Nazi story called The Third Way. Let me see if I can find this on my bookshelf here. All right. At the beginning of the first chapter, I have a quotation, and let me read it to you. And listen very carefully, because I think you're going to have your mind blown when you hear who's saying this, all right? And this appeared in a lengthy op-ed piece, all right, that was written by this individual. Quote, "It is obvious that the United States is fully controlling the Kiev Nazis, Poroshenko personally, and the government, and is pushing them to pursue this war against Donbass to the very end. This is a war by the United States against us. So we have to understand that the key to resolving the catastrophe of the Ukraine is to be found in Washington. That's where Nazism has to be defeated," unquote. Now, guess who said that? This was a comment made by Sergei Glaziev, a Russian economist and a personal advisor to President Vladimir Putin. So in other words, the Russians are saying, if you strip away all of the references to contemporary geopolitical events, the Russians are saying that there's some Nazi element that they're having to deal with. And it's not just in Kiev. It has its fingers in Washington, and it's therefore international. This is what they're saying. So in other words, I do think that it is possible that we are looking at a covert war here with the events that you're describing in China, with these factories blowing up and so on and so forth. I think
Did you see those pictures of that factory that just got obliterated in China?
In Chongqing, yes, I did.
I mean, my goodness, it was like the size of multiple city blocks. It looked like It got hit with some type of, I know there's a lot of speculation that the rod of God, some space weapon hit it or whatever, but it certainly wasn't, in my opinion, a explosion from the factory.
Well, it may or may not have been. I don't know. But even if it was simply a large-scale chemical explosion, that still implies, and there have been so many of them since then in China, that it implies that either the Chinese are terribly incompetent when it comes to their chemical factories, which I honestly don't think they are, but it implies to me some sort of covert operation. Now, whether there was an exotic technology that was used in the first one, I simply don't know. I'm rather skeptical of rod of God explanations and so on. But given the fact that you might be dealing with a group with access to trillions of dollars in funds over several decades, that implies immediately the ability to have developed some very exotic and sophisticated technology. Yes, it does. And the reason for that, again, goes back to what I said about this threefold strategic problem that the American military industrial establishment has after World War II. You've got communists, you've got Nazis running around somewhere in the world that are still experimenting with some of this stuff, and that's been the burden of some of my books to show. But you also have the UFO problem. And I think they took the decision that we need a lot of money. We need a mega Manhattan project, in other words, developing secret technologies over a prolonged period of time. And this is going to require an absolutely hidden system of finance. We cannot have even black budget oversight on this stuff because it's too sensitive. And this is why I think they set up this system in the first place. And that implies, therefore, that what they're really aiming at is to achieve some sort of performance parity via technological means with what they see UFOs doing. So yeah, I think the possibility exists that you're dealing with a breakaway group with access to technologies that even the highest levels of the government are not aware of, because I think they long ago lost control of this thing. So yeah, you could have exotic technologies in play. In that book, The Third Way, I went so far as to suggest that because of the presence of this post-war fascist international with access to funding like this in the billions of dollars, with its tentacles everywhere present in the world. I mean, my word, the Nazis were connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. They were connected to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. They were connected to the World Anti-Communist League in Taiwan, which is that notorious CIA front, which is still in existence, by the way. Now it's the World Endowment for Democracy or some such thing.
Oh my gosh, man! That's
yeah,
terrible.
it's just you start researching this, and you're dealing with a picture quite literally of Don Corleone sitting down and talking to Joachim von Ribbentrop and Martin Bormann and the head of the CIA. In other words, you're dealing with a mafia quite literally that has its tentacles into drug running and advanced technology and Muslim fundamentalists and Chinese anti-communists. It's
Right.
just this. It's a huge thing, and until people think that what I'm saying is nuts, but when you actually read the books and read the details and the footnotes and the connections, it does appear to me that we have in existence in the world an international group with vast amounts of money, with a covert operations intelligence network able to pull off some of this stuff, and with in my opinion, very possibly access to some very exotic technologies.
Every other day I look up in the sky. Well, I look up in the skies all the time, but every other day I see these chemtrails, jets just blasting all sorts of stuff into the skies, doing X
Yeah.
patterns, checkerboard patterns, etc. And they're certainly not your typical contrails because shortly after they spray these chemicals, it gets very cloudy and it's this
Yeah.
weird haze, etc. So do you think that that's associated with this break-off society? And why do you think they're doing it? I mean, what's the purpose? Obviously, they're blocking out the sun, but there's got to be a lot more to it than just that.
Well, I have never written anything publicly about the chemtrail phenomenon. In fact, I have to be honest with you and say it's not a phenomenon that I have researched in anywhere near the detail that other people have. But that said, um, I strongly suspect that this is for a very, very different purpose than most explanations I've seen coming out of the alternative community. I think it is for the purpose, ultimately, of electrifying or rendering more conductive the atmospheric electrical cavity of the planet. And the reason I think that is that when you read some of the heavy metals that have been sprayed into the atmosphere in particulate form, I've read cases of aluminum silicate, I've read cases of barium, of all things. You've got these very, very heavy metals being sprayed into the atmosphere. And the only thing I can think of that you would do this for is to increase the electrical conductivity of the atmospheric medium of the planet. Now, why would you do that? Any number of explanations there come forward. You might be doing it because you're concerned about the collapsing field strength of the Earth's magnetic field. You might be doing it to increase the shielding properties from ultraviolet, that sunlight comes through that the magnetic field wouldn't be protecting us from as it's weakening. Or, the last one, and here it comes, is you are increasing the electrical conductivity of the atmospheric medium for the purpose of some sort of weaponization. And when you put it in those terms, what they're doing is they're weaponizing the planet for some reason. And if that sounds crazy, just remember something. A fuel air bomb, a so-called thermobaric bomb, is a bomb that has the brisance, the explosive power of a tactical nuke. You can make these things, in other words, quite large. And here's the kicker: they're not radioactive bombs. So in other words, these are bombs that would be tailor-made if you wanted to carpet bomb a place and have the effect of nuclear annihilation without having to live with the fallout afterwards. You can do it. The Russians, you can go online and see a Russian video of a test of what's called the father of all bombs, a massive fuel air bomb that just literally flattens, an area that we would associate with an atomic bomb going off. And it actually looks like an atomic bomb going off, although it isn't. But a thermobaric bomb, in some explanations that are out there, disperses a particulate form. It creates a chain molecule of heavy metals, which are then detonated electromagnetically by a pulse, an electric pulse. So in other words, you're creating lots of mini bombs that use the atmosphere itself to set off a magnificently huge shockwave on the level of an atomic bomb. But a fuel air bomb disperses this into the air by a small explosion, and that's followed, of course, by the big one when the actual dispersed fuel is set off. So they use, oftentimes, allegedly, again, this is all very classified technology, so this is all guesswork, and I want people to understand this. Allegedly, they use particulate metal like this, aluminum, silicate, and other things that have magnesium and so on, that have properties of being able to burn very quickly when they're pulsed electrically, and then you use the atmosphere itself as the oxidizing fuel to drive all of this. So you stop and think about that in connection with chemtrails, and you could be kind of creating a regional fuel air bomb, if you will, that you can detonate. So there's any number of explanations here. Again, I haven't researched it very carefully or thoroughly. It's not an area that I've ever gotten into in any detail, but that's kind of my off the top of my head wild speculation.
Sure. Yeah, and you talked some about the transhuman movement.
Yes.
There's different levels of that, and
Yes.
I am wondering if all these chemical trails that they spray, obviously they're dispersing so many different microscopic
Yes.
metals, etc.
Yes.
And I'll bet you most of the planet has absorbed some of these substances, whether it be via air or food or water.
Yes.
Do you think that might be incorporated with this transhuman
Oh,
movement?
yes, it could be. Yeah, it could be some form of engineering of the human organism itself. And the reason I say that, Rex, is I have a good friend, that has Morgellons disease.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, and I know his physician. She's very well known as a researcher in the Morgellons field, and I have seen her research and analysis of the materials taken out of his lesions on his body when he's had outbreaks of this stuff. And there are these tiny plastic nanofibers that are quite literally growing in the man. So yeah, I don't leave it. I don't rule out of the picture that this might be some sort of huge engineering project of the human organism itself. I put nothing past these people. So that's a possibility. Absolutely.
Well, and you say these people. Do you think that these people could be the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, these aristocratic people that are talked about in the conspiracy realms, or do you feel that there's another faction besides them or in connection with them?
I'll probably upset a lot of listeners here. I do think that the big major financial families certainly have their fingers in a lot of pies. There's no doubt about this. And I'll give you an example from this whole Nazi international extraterritorial state idea of mine. In the Nazi International, I uncovered a bit of information that just blew my mind. It still blows my mind to this day. That early in the 1960s, there was a CBS journalist by the name of Paul Manning, who was a close associate of the old pre-Cronkite Ed Murrow. All right. So in other words, this guy was very high up in the CBS organization. He did a study called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. Okay. He was one of the first to conclude that Bormann had made it out and was heading up this worldwide Nazi organization. All right. Well, he took the book when he had it in galley form. He took the book to Alan Dulles and let Dulles read it. And of course, Dulles at this time is the head of the CIA, Director of Central Intelligence. And his comment to Paul Manning was, "You're on the right track." In other words, Martin Bormann was alive and well in Argentina. And Manning uncovered an episode that just threw him for a loop, and it throws everybody who's familiar with it for a loop. Because in the early 60s, apparently Martin Bormann had cashed a check for several $1 million. And the check was drawn on Chase Manhattan. There's your Rockefeller connection. And National Hanover's Bank, and here's the kicker. It was cleared, incidentally, by Deutsche Bank in Argentina. Okay, so there's another connection for you. But the check was written over his own signature. Jeez. So in other words, yeah, we have a high-ranking Nazi, the head of the Nazi Party, the real power behind the throne throughout most of the war period, cashing checks over his own signature. Now, this means essentially that what the banks know is he's alive, and these are his funds. That's what all of this means. Now, the real kicker here is Nelson Rockefeller. You know, everybody thinks of David Rockefeller, but I'm going to talk about Nelson Rockefeller, because guess what Nelson Rockefeller is during World War II? Well, he's President Roosevelt's advisor, intelligence advisor for, guess what, South America. Okay. So in other words, you keep running into all these little dots, and by the time you end up accumulating all of these little dots, you've got these connections. So yeah, I think people like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the DuPonts and the Warburgs and so on and so forth are certainly involved at a very high level. But I do not think these people are at the highest level. Because as I indicated, you're dealing with a hidden system of finance. Now, to make that work, obviously, you're going to have the participation of some major prime banks in the world. But they're not ultimately going to be the ones controlling the money flow itself, and more importantly, what the money's being used for. So I do regard them as high-level players, but I regard them as kind of upper-middle management in whatever structure that we're looking at here. I think the real powers behind the throne are the intelligence operatives, the people in positions where they have access to intelligence, where they can coordinate covert operations, and of course, finally and most importantly, if you're developing all this exotic technology, the people that are really running the show are the technicians and engineers and scientists themselves that are creating all of this. So you're dealing with something that is in a certain sense very different from your standard conspiracy. You know, the bankers are behind it all, the Jews are behind it all, the Masons are behind it all. You're dealing with a very different thing here, because this organization has its tentacles into every aspect of
For the second half, or for the next part of the show here, I know that you write a lot about the Babylonian Banksters,
yes,
the alchemy of deep physics, high finance, and ancient religion.
Right.
So one thing I just want to bring up real quick before we get into this is there are so many financial institutions out there and banks out there that use some type of sun symbol.
Yes.
And I recently watched a series. I talked about this yesterday with Freeman when we had him on the show, because he put together a recent podcast that had some synchronicities. And there was a series that just came out on the Sci-Fi Channel that was a movie that came out by Arthur C. Clarke many years ago called Childhood's End.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in this series, there are these extraterrestrials that basically take over humankind with a peaceful intentions that they give the people what they think that it is. But in reality, they blow up the planet at the end, and these aliens look like ETs, etc. So during that film, there was this one scene also that showed this bank, and it wasn't even a real bank, but of course, in the series, this bank has the sun as its logo. Even in TV shows and the media, they always portray money and financial institutions with some type of sun sign. And when you talk about alchemy and deep physics and high finance, I think that money in and of itself is a form of alchemy.
Yes,
so I just wanted to throw that out there and get your information on this.
Well, the sun would be a perfect symbol for both alchemy in a general sense and for alchemy in a financial sense, in that, you know, ultimately all of us and the world we live in are star stuff, at least according to the standard prevailing scientific view, because stars are quite literally the furnace, and I'm using the alchemical term here, are quite literally the furnace that creates the elements that comprise us, that make us up. So in other words, the old mythology that we are, children of the stars is actually a mythology that, if you look at it from a certain point of view, has a certain scientific basis. And the idea of alchemy here, of the kind of alchemy that we're talking about, is really the creation of information within a medium. And this is precisely what banks do when they create money. When they loan money, they're literally creating money. And what they're doing is they're adding information to a system. Now, for my own approach to all of this, and I kind of outlined this in Babylon's Banksters, the book that you referred to, my approach to all of this has always been that there is a close and indeed inextricable connection between the basic physics worldview that a society or civilization has and the financial system that it has. You can have a worldview where your physics is a closed system and is always running down. In other words, it's always proceeding towards entropy. There's nothing injected, so to speak, into the system from outside. You can never have over unity. You can never have free energy, and so on and so forth. In that kind of financial system, in that kind of physics system, you're going to mirror it with a financial system where you can never pay off the interest on principal. And this is essentially the banking system that we have. This is essentially the monetary system that we have, because the money that is in our wallets right now, the Federal Reserve note, is monetized debt. All right. Now, the other flip side of the coin is if you have an open system physics, if you have a system of energy that is not based upon a dwindling finite supply non-renewable resource, as petroleum is allegedly said to be, and please note I said allegedly said to be because there's even debate on that. But we know who put out the idea that petroleum was a fossil fuel, don't we? And it's, of course, Rockefeller. All right. Why? Well, because if you make an energy resource non-renewable, you make it scarce, you make it valuable, and you can empower a system of debt finance based on it. This whole system of petrodollars is precisely that. But if you have an energy system where you are quite literally drawing energy from the zero-point energy or the vacuum flux or the space-time fabric, whatever you wish to call it, when you're drawing energy from that source, it's virtually inexhaustible, it's limitless, it's renewable, and moreover, and more importantly, once you get the technology to do it, basically anybody can do it. Well, what kind of financial system would you have there? Well, you'd have an open system of finance based on the creation or production of things rather than based on the monetization of debt. So you'd have a very, very different system. Now, if we turn the clock back to, let's say, ancient Sumer, it's very interesting to see what types of system were there originally as opposed to what ultimately came to be the system. Originally, money in Mesopotamia was simply a clay tablet. It was their version of paper money, so to speak. It was a medium of exchange based on the surplus in the state warehouse. All right. So in other words, it was debt-free money. But you could not exchange this money if you were conducting trade, let's say with India or the Indus Valley. You had to have a mechanism by which to conduct trade over a much more widespread region. And ultimately what we see happening is the substitution of a scarce commodity, in this case bullion, gold and silver bullion, for these notes of exchange. And of course, this introduces what we now know all too well as the welfare, warfare, slavery complex, because you're caught, once you do this, you're caught in a vicious circle, because you have to get the armies to go conquer the places that have the gold and silver to pay the armies, and have the slaves to mine the gold and silver to pay the armies that you're going to conquer. So you begin to see this interesting cycle that arises right about the time that we begin to see the great empires, the Persians, the Macedonians, the Romans, the Chinese. You begin to see these great empires rising precisely to feed this cycle. So there's an interesting thing that happens here. You have the alliance of open systems of finance with so-called debt-free money, and then you see closed systems of physics aligning themselves with monetized debt. And the most interesting thing here the most interesting pattern that I think you see in ancient times is the alliance of the financial power with the temple, with religion. And again, I think the reasons here are very clear as to why this is being done. Even today, we have this alliance hinted at with our motto on our money, "In God we trust." The reasons I think are very clear. You need to give your actions the probity or sanction, the moral sanction, so to speak, of the religious aspect of society. You need to give it the sanction of the gods. So you see this close alignment of the clergy in these societies that are starting to do this with the actual act of money changing itself. I mean, recall the incident from the New Testament with Christ, driving the money changers out of the temple. Well, why are the money changers in the temple? That's, to begin with, that to me is the really important question here.
Right.
And I think that is part of the explanation why.
And you also talk about different ancient religions and the power that they have had within society today. So, let's jump into that for a minute. They're the pyramids that are scattered around the world in Egypt, Chichen Itza, in Mexico, China, everywhere. They all have some type of similar geometrical pattern and shape. But what's their purpose?
Well, nobody knows for sure, and I'd be lying if I told you I know for sure. But I got my start doing all these weird books about the Great Pyramid, and indeed it was discussions around the card playing table between my father and this other engineer in Sioux Falls that kind of touched off my interest in all this, because I remember very vividly one Friday night they're all sitting around the table playing pitch. And I'm sitting there watching them and listening to the conversation, and my dad and the other engineer are talking about, the wonders of the Great Pyramid, being this remarkably over-engineered structure. And it really is, if you stop and think about the standard Egyptological explanation that this was some sort of pharaonic ritual object, then for crying out loud, why are you aligning the structure with nearly optical precision to the 4 cardinal compass points? Why are you cutting and facing stones, if indeed that's what you've actually been doing, so that you can't even slip a knife blade in between the stones with such precision, and all of the other stuff that's built into the structure, the amazing redundancies of physical constants of local celestial space or geodetic measures. Why are all these being built into a structure ostensibly to bury a pharaoh?
Right.
You don't need to do all this to bury people, folks. So there's something else going on here. And I take Chris Dunn's, I jump off from Chris
That was a good book.
Oh, it's an excellent book, the Giza power plant. I take his point of view that, looking at it from the eyes of an engineer rather than Egyptologist, what you're looking at is a machine. And therefore, if it's a machine, well, then what's it being used for? And of course, in his opinion, it's clear from the title of his book, The Giza Power Plant. And I take it one step further, that even you don't build in dimensional analogs of local cosmological space into a power plant. You would do it if you are creating a coupled harmonic oscillator to the 0-point energy as it's configured in local space-time. So in other words, once you've said that, then you look at the positioning of these pyramids around the world, and it is possible that you might be looking at some huge machine-like grid for whatever purpose. In my opinion, I'm very clear, it's a very bizarre, it's a very wild, it's a very out there, far out idea that these, and particularly the Great Pyramid, may have been part of some sort of weapons system. And the reason I say that is I get into, some of the texts that Zecharia Sitchin got into. And when I read his book, The War of Gods and Men, he mentions the use of pyramids as weapons, but he doesn't really follow it up. He doesn't give you any indication of how significant that kind of observation really is. So I went out in the pyramid books and then in a book called The Cosmic War to examine some of these texts to see if, in fact, what Sitchin is saying about them is true, and if they could be conceivably used as an argument or as components of an argument that maybe some of these structures were very sophisticated machines, weaponry, reliant upon principles of physics that we've largely forgotten. And my tentative answer to all of that has obviously been yes. So I look at these things very, very differently than most people, and I can't say that I have the answer to why you have all of these pyramids all over the world, but it is intriguing to note that almost everywhere that you do have them, there's some association religiously or in their historical lore with the quote unquote gods. All right, and in many cases of this lore, particularly the Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Hittite and so on, you have associations of these structures with the wars of the gods. So there's a clear hint that this is something that was part of a technological matrix that we don't really understand. And that's what my books about the pyramid attempt to do. They attempt to understand what may have been going on. And briefly, it's again a kind of physics that taps into the configuration of the fabric of local space-time. In other words, the celestial geometry, if you will, of the solar system. So yeah, I think you're dealing with something very, very sophisticated.
Now, also in the 70s, there was a real big popularity movement on pyramid power, people like Dr.
Yes.
Patrick Flanagan, etc.
Yes.
And some of the claims are that there was a lot of scientific data that proves that if you have a properly built pyramid facing magnetic north and you place it over a razor blade, then the razor blade will last longer. It can purify foods and drinks and make milk last longer before it goes bad. So do you think there's truth to that?
Oh, yes, I do, and I'll tell you why.
Great.
That's an excellent question. In my pyramid books, specifically in the book called The Giza Death Star Deployed, I get into some research that was conducted at a government level by a major government in the world and conducted secretly for at least 2 decades. And guess what the government was?
What's that?
It was the Soviet Union. You can go to Russia, just outside of Moscow and at other places around Russia, and find these enormous fiberglass pyramids of all shapes and configurations that you can imagine that were built as part of a top secret study that was conducted inside the Soviet Union into so-called pyramid power. And they detail some of these things about plants, about the preservative properties of pyramids and certain kinds of foods placed in plants. They documented other unusual properties about them as well, and all of this was conducted very, very secretly. And you can imagine the attitude of American spy satellite photo analysts that are seeing the Russians are all of a sudden building all these pyramids.
Right.
It's just like, what the heck are they up to? But yeah, these studies are out there. They're fairly well known now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when all of this stuff, or I should say, some of this stuff at least became public. I still think that the Russians have never completely said what they found in toto. But the Russians have been investigating odd aspects of physics like this for quite some time. And they've even proposed some of the theories behind what's going on, and I mentioned some of those in that Giza Death Star Deployed book. It is fascinating stuff, and there is clearly something about these structures that does manipulate the energy of the medium, so to speak, at a very fundamental level. And I don't think there's any theory out there in standard public consumption physics, so to speak, that can adequately explain it. So you have to look at alternative theories. There was a Ukrainian physicist by the name of Dr. Volodymyr Krasnoholovets that did propose some theories, and I reviewed some of his papers that he and a topologist by the name of Bunias wrote in topology journals concerning some of this stuff.
Right. And, you also wonder sometimes, or I wonder sometimes, if maybe just the Earth's magnetic ley lines and the stars, the way that they're placed, etc., combined with some type of structure, like the pyramid, it's based a certain direction, it has a certain dimension. Maybe those lights that reflect off of it are what causes those incredible anomalies. Who knows? I mean, that's just speculation on my part, but...
Well, I do think, I talk about this to some degree in another book of mine called Grid of the Gods. I do think that there is a great deal of evidence that these structures, pyramidal and otherwise, even some of the megalithic structures, are placed at certain key locations on the globe. And I believe that what you're dealing with to offer some sort of theory here, is if you know what a standing wave is, let's say that you've got a balloon immersed in water, and you tap the balloon simultaneously at different points on its surface and watch the interference patterns as the wave spreads over the surface of that balloon. Buckminster Fuller did experiments of this sort, pulsing balloons that he had painted with ultrasound and so on, and watching the interference patterns gather on the surface of the balloon. Well, this is what I'm talking about. And I strongly suspect that what the world grid system is it is a grid system laid out in response to standing wave interferometry patterns that are going over the surface of the Earth at certain nodal points. And where the nodal points are located is very significant, because if you view these nodal points in terms of a vector analysis, what you would have at these points is a zero-summed vector system. Okay? Now, let me explain what all that means. A vector in physics is obviously a translation from one point to another. It's a force acting on a certain body to move it from one point to another. All right. Now, a zero-summed vector system is where all of the vectors add up, or the total force, translation force, please note, sums to zero. All right. So in other words, there's no movement from one point to another at the point where they sum to zero. But this is where modern physics is gets very interesting, because a modern physicist looking at the system of linear algebra and differential equations that they deal with will look at these zero-sum vector systems and say, well, there's no translation, and therefore any zero-sum vector system is equivalent to any other zero-sum vector system. And this is not true, because if you look carefully, you can have 4 vectors summing to 0, you can have 5, you can have 6, you can have any number of vectors summing to 0. But the infolded energy at that point is going to be different because of the geometrical configuration of the system. All right? Follow me? Now, because of that, you have to look at those vectors of force which sum to a scalar. This is what scalars are. It's simply a pure magnitude of force with no direction, with no translation, all right, with no movement from one point to another. And if you look at it that way, then the scalar signature of the system in different vector systems summing to 0 is going to be different. So if you look carefully, just to extend this analogy further, I think what you're looking at with these ancient structures is you've placed them at certain nodal points where you have zero-sum vector systems with interesting internal scalar signatures. In other words, we're dealing, I think, with a grid that works off of so-called scalar physics. Now, there's a great deal of outcry within the scientific community questioning the whole idea of a scalar physics. Well, what I'm saying is simply that most scientists are taught not to look at those infolded zero-sum vector systems, all right? And the reason why is if you go back to the equations of James Clerk Maxwell, the original ones that he actually wrote, not the ones that you're taught that he wrote, okay? If you look at Maxwell's original equations, he does have this scalar potential in those equations. In other words, he knows that there is an internal structure even in a zero-sum vector system that may not be issuing in any translation, but that does have a magnitude of force at that particular point. And he put all of this into a form of mathematics known as quaternions. Quaternions deal with this, all right? If you learn Maxwell's equations today, that whole infolded zero-sum vector system has been taken completely out of the equations, okay? In other words, they've been recast or edited in a form that got rid of this. And this was all done by the British physicist Oliver Heaviside, all right, who wanted to eliminate this mystical component of, as he called it, of Maxwell's system. So yeah, I think you're dealing with these ancient structures with the possibility that they knew something about this type of physics that we have forgotten, and in fact that it looks apparently that has been deliberately edited out of the modern physics textbooks and thinking. So, take that for whatever it's worth.
And also there is so much information about the apex of the pyramid, the esophagus of the pyramid, and some people have asked before if possibly there might be a more spiritual reasoning of these pyramids as well. Like,
sure.
Maybe as a very highly adept priest or, magi in that time, you would go into this specific room and have some type of out-of-body experience where it would project your soul or your essence into the sun or through the sun into another portal. Do you think there's any truth to that, or do you feel that's just, psychobabble woo-woo stuff?
Well, part of me, I'll be honest, I go 50-50 with ideas like that. Part of me thinks it is kind of New Age Gnostic nonsense. But the other part of me thinks that there has to be a consciousness component to some of this type of physics. Simply because quantum mechanics came along and told us that there is a consciousness component to physics, and most people don't want to deal with it. So I go both ways. The problem is we have yet to fully understand. We're simply right now on the cusp of understanding the interaction between conscious intention and physical systems. We're at the very beginning of understanding this. So when it comes to structures like that, with all of their complexity, I mean, my word, you look at the Great Pyramid alone and look at the complexity of physical constants, of dimensional analogs to various things within local celestial space that are built into the structure redundantly and deliberately. When you look at it that way, it is very difficult to say that anybody has a full understanding of what is really behind the thinking that created that structure. So I can't rule it out of the picture, certainly. And then, of course, you have the whole Assyrian religion in Egypt itself arising at some point in history for whatever reason. And I think it's very possible that it may arise out of some misunderstood legacy civilization, misunderstanding the physics that created the structures in the first place. So yeah, I think once you start down these speculative roads, you have to entertain almost any hypothesis, but you have to be aware that when you're entertaining hypotheses, to preserve your hierarchy of value and possibilities. Is it a low possibility? Is it a high possibility? Right now, I'd say it's probably somewhere in the middle.
Who do you think built the pyramids?
Well, we have to ask the question in the right way. Well, if we say who built the pyramids, well, what pyramids? There are pyramids in Mesoamerica, there are pyramids in Mexico, there are pyramids in Latin America, there's pyramids in China, there's pyramids in Mesopotamia, and of course the pyramids in Egypt. So if you look at all of these structures and lump them together, it becomes a difficult question to answer, because these pyramids are built obviously at different places and points of time in history. All right. But if we look at Egypt alone for a moment to kind of simplify the chronological problems of this question, if you look at the progression of construction techniques in Egypt, you're confronted with a real problem, because the pyramids in Egypt that are of obviously Egyptian construction show a marked decline in construction ability over time. For example, if you look at Dashur in Egypt with the Red Pyramid and the so-called Bent Pyramid, these are pyramids that very clearly were built by the Egyptians themselves. But when you compare those pyramids to the three major pyramids at Giza, and in particular to the two big pyramids at Giza, you see a very, very marked decline in the quality of workmanship between Dashur and Giza. And when you look at Giza itself, it becomes even more problematic, because I think the Great Pyramid, and we could be here all night talking about my reasons why I think this, but I think the Great Pyramid at Giza is far older than Egypt itself. In other words, I think the Great Pyramid at Giza is the oldest structure on that compound.
Do you think it's around 12,000 years old, or even older than that?
I think it may even be older than that. I think we're looking at the oldest structure on the planet, quite frankly, when we look at that thing. So this would predate Egypt immensely. And then the second pyramid, the Sphinx and so on, I think those elements of the Giza compound occupy a second chronological layer at Giza. Not as old as the Great Pyramid, but still quite old. And then you have Mycenaeus and the actual Egyptian pyramids at Giza that date from an actual Egyptian pyramid. So to answer your question, some of these structures, Teotihuacan being another one, the Aztecs claim that when they found Teotihuacan, it had been there all along and was abandoned. So I think the possibility exists that we're looking at structures, at least at Teotihuacan, that are very, very old. that predate the Mesoamerican civilizations that we've been told about, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, and the Maya, and so on. Who built these things is a different question, because obviously when you look at these structures and the immense amount of astronomical, geodetic, and just pure physical information built into them, they were clearly built by somebody with a profound knowledge of basic astronomical and geodetical data. So in other words, this implies a degree of scientific sophistication. And when you entertain the thesis that these are built at nodal points of standing wave interferometry patterns on the planet Earth, then this also implies a geophysics sophistication that really kind of boggles the mind. So it had to have been built by some sort of very sophisticated high culture. And I entertain the possibility that this culture, as it flew apart, so to speak, or blew itself apart, as I think is actually the case, that this culture maintained certain elites that preserved this knowledge in some form or fashion, and that may have built some of these structures. So I think the possibility exists with some of these things that we are looking at structures older than the classical civilizations of academic history, namely Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and so on. So I think these are very, very old. And the problem really becomes compounded when you look at places in South America like Pumapunku and places like this in Bolivia and the high Andes, where you see a construction technique, again, that just boggles the mind from anything that could have existed according to the academic model in ancient times.
Right. And, I talked to Michael Cremo. He wrote a
Yes.
book called Forbidden Archaeology, where they've
Yes.
got artifacts and tools and jewelry that's in coal deposits that are over
Right.
100 million years old. So,
Yeah.
and that's another thing when you talk about these breakaway civilizations that might make someone speculate maybe these civilizations and certain bloodlines and family lines have been around for not
A long
just
time.
Yeah, right. So this technology they can take from generation to generation to generation. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Joseph, is what is your opinion on aliens and the extraterrestrial presence?
Well, I'm not philosophically opposed. I get asked this question all the time. I'm not philosophically opposed to the idea of extraterrestrials. All right. My problem has been all along that we need harder evidence than we have actually been presented with. Now, the reason I'm not philosophically opposed is when you get back into the study of ancient texts and so on, from a certain point of view or a certain place of interpretation of these texts, you definitely get the idea that somebody else was here long before the rise of modern man, according to the standard academic theories, about 150 to 200,000 years ago, that somebody else was here. I mean, the ancient texts are very clear; they tell you this. And the interesting thing about what they tell you in most cases is that you're dealing with genetic cousins. In other words, you're dealing with some other aspect of the human family other than Homo sapiens sapiens. In other words, we're the species Homo sapiens sapiens. There might be another part of the genus Homo sapiens out there that came here and sort of kicked things off. We don't know. But you also have in those texts, you have the allusions, to Quetzalcoatl or Viracocha or the feathered serpent. You've got the fishman Oannes in the Babylonian mythology. You also have the appearance of chimerical creatures, part human, part something else. And again, I look at that in terms of these things being possibly mythological presentations of genetic engineering of some sort of chimerical creatures. So I'm not opposed to it. I think you have to be, if you look at these texts, you have to be willing to entertain those kinds of possibilities. It's when you start down the path of saying, well, all this exotic technology comes from crashed and reverse engineered flying saucers, that I really, really get upset. That's one of my hot buttons. Because what this does, and I get this all the time, about my Nazi research, well, couldn't the Germans have just found a crashed flying saucer and reverse engineered it? Well, of course they could. But the very fact that you're saying that you can reverse engineer this stuff to begin with implies a technological near parity between two very different technological civilizations, namely the extraterrestrial and the human one. And what that tactic really does is it prevents you from looking at the human capability, the human provenance in the scientific literature, in the engineering literature, that might indicate a provenance for some of these technologies. That's my big beef with that whole approach, is it takes you away from really looking hard and deep at the possibilities. And, you know, I like to make the joke that if you start down the reverse engineering road, you know, ET is crashing so many flying saucers that we're reverse engineering that pretty soon we're going to have to start crashing our stuff on their world so they can catch back up with us. I mean, you know, this is kind of a go nowhere research methodology, in other words, and it just really, really frustrates me, because I go out of my way to try and document where I think this stuff is coming from without recourse to that go nowhere hypothesis. I'm trying to find the documents, I'm trying to give you the footnotes, I'm trying to give you the arguments, and then along comes, you know, the ET advocate, and they want to sweep all this under the rug by saying, well, this is just all reverse engineering. Humanity can't do anything or think of anything on its own. It always has to be a crashed flying saucer. And sorry, I just don't go there.
Well, that takes away from, you know, the human archetype, the overall essence of mankind. And
yeah,
I think
exactly.
that's unfortunate. But when I asked you about that, Joseph, I just wanted to get your interpretation. You know, where do you think these flying saucers that crashed in Roswell and, you know, the Phoenix Lights that thousands and thousands of people saw? I mean, do you think that that might possibly be from a civilization from planet Earth from tens of thousands of years ago that broke off?
Well, let me give you the Phoenix Lights example that I hear a lot. Was, you know, the triangular craft that was apparently seen by so many people in Phoenix was
huge.
It was huge. Well, you get the argument from people that, well, this couldn't possibly be human. We couldn't build anything that huge. And if you stop and think about that argument, it's a non sequitur. It proves nothing about the origin of where it might have come from. You cannot make size equals extraterrestrial, big equals extraterrestrial, little equals human. Because if you go down that path, you're soon going to be discovering you're in a whole world of engineering anomaly. You know, look at the Hindenburg, look at the scale of things that we were building with 1930s technology. We were building balloons essentially with truss work and so on inside them, as big as the Empire State Building. So in other words, we do have the technology to build things like this if you stop and put your mind to an examination of these things. So I do not automatically leap to extraterrestrial just because somebody says, well, it was huge, it had to have been extraterrestrial. No, it doesn't. It could be a big balloon filled with helium gas with electrostatically charged edges that create a charge differential to propel you around, that you can literally degas and fold up, okay? There's all sorts of possibilities, and we need to get out of the habit of mind of leaping to instantly to extraterrestrial just because of things like this. Now, the Roswell thing, I can tell you what I think about Roswell by pointing out the fact I wrote a book that ufology loves to ignore. I mean, the silence has been deafening, called Roswell and the Reich, okay? And that tells you right there what I think probably crashed there. I think it was something Nazi.
That's interesting. Have you ever heard of Douglas Dietrich?
Oh, yes, I've heard of Douglas Dietrich. I've heard, you know, Ann Jacobson and so on and so forth. And the problems I have with that approach, again, is that this is whistleblower testimony. And I'm not I don't, if you read my books, you'll find that what I do is I research documents and research the provenance of technologies. I construct speculative arguments, but I don't rely on whistleblower testimony.
The only reason I brought up Douglas Dietrich is he was actually a document destroyer back at the
I know the story.
So I've talked to him several times, and whether I believe this or not, I mean, I don't know what to believe, but he claims, and he gives a very compelling story, that the Roswell crash was actually Japanese prisoners of war and a technology that was created by the U.S./Nazi/Japanese technology. So it's just kind of...
I've heard that too.
Yeah.
I've heard that too. Again, compare the story to the case I outlined in Roswell and the Reich. Because what I do in Roswell and the Reich is I with a fine-tooth comb, analyze the Roswell research people themselves, and I analyze the documents that they refer to. And the documents themselves are the real giveaway as to what's going on. So let's assume for the moment, I do not believe the story that, to be blunt, that Dietrich is putting out, simply because, number one, it's a story. Okay, it's not analysis, it's not research. Anybody can get on
doesn't
camera.
Sorry to interrupt, Joseph. I just wanted to say real quick, doesn't it kind of correlate to what you're saying, though?
No, it doesn't, because what I'm saying it is that this is not a crash of something that the Nazis and Americans are building as part of some black project. What I'm saying is it's a crash of a technology coming from this independent Nazi group. And there's a world of difference between the two, because this would mean, and to my mind, explain why the US military reacts as it did. Because what they're doing is they're trying to cover up the existence of an independent post-war fascist organization that supposedly has been defeated in this huge world war that we just fought. Now stop and think about that. If you have something crashing in the New Mexico desert that is clearly of a human technological provenance, but it isn't yours, are you going to panic? Well, yeah, you will. And you're going to panic even more if you start digging into this debris and discovering that it has a clear technological signature that points to Germany.
Right.
Because if that's the case, then what this means is you're dealing with a group out there somewhere in the world that's still continuing to research this stuff and to produce it, and you don't know where they are. And that means you've got a huge military problem on your hands. Now, again, this is a reading. I want to stress something here. This is very important. This is a reading based on the actual Roswell researchers themselves, the documents that they cite, and then cite in a one-sided fashion. In other words, when they're citing the Shulgin Intelligence Collection Memorandum of 1947, there are passages in that memorandum, even in the version that they cited, that are clearly pointing the finger at the Nazis. So why is this being ignored in their evaluations of what happened at Roswell? It's being cavalierly dismissed. And the other thing I'm not doing is I'm not basing any of my analysis or research on the stories of whistleblowers that are coming out of the government woodwork and telling us stories. Because again, the reason why we have to be very careful is that this could all still be part of the cover-up operation. We don't know. So in other words, I'll be very honest with you, Rex, I avoid, like the plague, anybody telling a story. I've had offers of people wanting to offer me information from inside the government, from inside court. I just do not go there. I try and base my arguments on public record, on the documents that other people have dug up, and try to synthesize and interpret these in a very different way. So
Sure.
I avoid the whistleblower. I avoid the whistleblower scene rigorously.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you certainly seem to have just so much information on different topics with all the books you've put together. Absolutely incredible. And I'd certainly like to thank you for coming on here tonight with
Sure.
us, Joseph, here at the Leak Project. Before we close out tonight, I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share with us, any new books you've got coming out or information that you're going to be giving to the public.
Well, I did speak last November at the Secret Space Program Conference in Bastrop, Texas. Those talks should be coming out publicly in the next couple months. People can look for that. I just published a book last year called The Third Way, the Nazi International Corporate Fascism and the European Union. That's all part of this story. I've got another book coming out later this year on Common Core, which seems unrelated to all this stuff, but read the book. It really isn't. And then I'm working on another book right now that I'm hoping to have come out later this year. I can't say what it's about because I never reveal what I'm writing about. But yeah, I'm always busy, so it's nonstop writing, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. And there's another thing too that I just wanted to bring up before we close out. When you put these books together, that just so much information that most people wouldn't even consider thinking about. Have you ever had any, I don't know, any push? Like, have you ever noticed any black Suburbans with tinted windows in your front yard or anything like that?
In other words, have I had any strange things happening to me? Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I have. It's been, I won't say constant, but there have been times that there have been odd things happen, and it's been consistent since I started writing these books, but it's not consistent in the sense that it's persistent. Every now and then, things will happen that indicate that somebody out there is taking notice or watching or things like that. I could be here, for another show and talk about some of those things. It's been nothing nothing on the order of white Suburbans parked outside, beaming microwave energy into the house,
Right.
or anything like that.
So what is your website? It's GizaDeathStar.com?
Right. It's a website. I blog daily about all sorts of topics, not just topics like this, but geopolitics, technologies, and things like that. It does have a members subscription area where I have some webinars up, a few papers up. We do every 2 weeks. I do what I call a vid chat with members from my website. Send me questions or comments, and we talk for a few hours, just kind of one-on-one online. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, fantastic. And hopefully we can have you on again with us sometime.
Sure, no problem.
Wonderful. And I'd also like to thank the Channy Project. There's a website out there called channy.envisionzone.com. Appreciate you guys with all that you do. And also, I noticed the other day that most of the videos that I've been coming out with have been published on projectavalon.net. So I'd also like to thank you guys. And ladies and gentlemen, appreciate you coming on with us tonight. Make sure to stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night. A very special thank you to our guest tonight. For all of you that had the opportunity to be here with us, if you enjoyed the show, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, for the most recent interviews, videos, and podcasts. Or you can check us out on the World Wide Web, www.leakproject.com. Would you like to be a guest on our show? Do you have information that the world needs to see and hear? Send us an email, guestbookings@leakproject.com. Thank you, everybody. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night. Inside the Borg and free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear hosting Leak Project. The Leak Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leak Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain-drained media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth. Programs, the Babylonian Banksters, and Alchemy of Money. Towards the end of the program, we will be discussing the transhuman movement and how that will affect our future society. You can find out more about Joseph's works at www.gizadeathstar.com. His books are also available on Amazon. So kick back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Mr. Farrell, it's great to have you on the show tonight with us. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on, Rex.
Yeah, it's great to have you on here with us. I had somebody a while ago that emailed me and asked if I could get you on the show. I've had the opportunity to read through some of your books. I went to your Amazon page. You've got just a huge following. And when I went through the reviews, 99% of the people that have read your books are just enthralled with what you have to say. That 1%, you can't please everybody. So, but I'd like to ask you, first of all, I'm a big fan of Sioux Falls. South Dakota is just an amazing state. I love the Black Hills, the Badlands, just a great place to go visit. But you know, with an education from Oxford University, that's such a highly acclaimed college, just amazing. You must have got just incredible grades through school. But what got you into this path with the research that you get into, Joseph?
Oh boy. Well, I've always been interested in strange stuff, to be quite honest with you. I guess in school, I was always kind of the enfant terrible. I was the kid asking all the wrong questions all the time. and never really satisfied, with giving the academic regurgitation answer. And I've always been interested in ancient civilizations and stuff. My father was an engineer, and some of their very good friends in town. We had friends that the husband was the engineer at the local CBS television station affiliate, Keloland, KELO in Sioux Falls. He actually had built from hand the color transmitter for the television station. That was the kind of guy he was. So
Very cool.
yeah, very cool. So I grew up in a family of nerds with nerds for friends, and that kind of explains how I got started in all this.
Nice. Now, I mean, you've got probably well over 20 years into research involved in the topics that we're going to discuss. And when I read your book, the Breakaway Societies, at the very beginning, it's funny because a lot of the questions that you say people are going to ask were the first things that came into my mind. And what I wanted to get into first, if we could, is the breakaway civilizations that you write about and discuss. Who's a part of it? How many secret civilizations are there?
Well, by the term breakaway civilization, that is actually a term that was coined by the well-known UFO researcher Richard Dolan. He wrote a 2-volume study called UFOs in the National Security State, which, as far as I'm concerned, are really the Bible. If you want to get into the study of UFOs, of the government reaction to them, those are very carefully researched from the documents, from personal testimony, and so on. They're just mammoth volumes, well footnoted. I'm an academic, so I live for footnotes. But it's his term, and what he meant by it was largely that as a response to the UFO phenomenon, the United States national security establishment basically may have come up over the years with such extraordinary technologies that in effect, and the infrastructure to create them, that in effect what we might be dealing with on Earth is a whole hidden underground sort of infrastructure or civilization, if you will, that has pulled so far ahead of the public civilization that we see, that in effect we're dealing with a group of people that have an entirely different decision-taking process, an entirely different kind of culture, things that they can access or have access to. Now, I've taken that term and run with it, and with some of his insights in the following way, because in those covert civilizations and breakaway civilizations, or covert civilizations and covert wars series, I forget the exact titles to my own books. In those,
Well, you have written a lot of them.
yeah, it's almost 24 now, approaching 24. In those books, what I do essentially is I outline a case that I've been building through many books regarding the relationship between post-war Nazism, the American national security state, and so on. And I've come to the following conclusions. Firstly, after World War II, the American national security establishment is essentially confronted with 3 strategic problems that it has. Number 1, the communist bloc, very obviously. Number 2, it's confronted with what I've been arguing is essentially a post-war extraterritorial Nazi state. It's an extraterritorial organization that's well-funded. It has its own kind of command structure. It has its own kind of intelligence structure. It certainly is engaged in covert operations of one sort or another after the war, ostensibly in many cases for the CIA. But when you dig into some of these operations, they're well-known historical events, you find that these Nazis are behaving very independently of their so-called American masters. Plus you have, of course, the presence in this country of a great deal of paperclip, Operation Paperclip Nazis that were brought over here to kind of jumpstart America's space program. So you have the awareness of the national security state, of this structure, and of, in certain cases, its interference with American goals and objectives and defense installations and so on. So this becomes a national security matter for them, because the real question here is, where are these folks based, and what are they up to? And then the third strategic problem, obviously, that the national security establishment has after the war is the UFO, which of course constitutes the most potential threat that they've got to deal with. So I've also argued that as a result of these 3 things, what they put into place was a completely hidden system of finance. And please understand what I mean here. I'm not talking about the black budget. I'm not talking about those items of finance that Congress votes and essentially turns over to the intelligence military industrial complex to do whatever they want to do with. I'm talking about a system that is entirely off the books and entirely free of congressional oversight. Now, this system was put into place by President Truman in 1947. I believe it was October or November of 1947. And the system is based on the top secret recovery of Axis loot, primarily of Japanese loot that was plundered from Asia and then buried all over the Philippine Islands, Luzon, Mindanao, and so on, prior to the end of the war. This was made known to him. It was first came to the attention of Captain Ed Lansdale, who's probably a figure that many of your people are familiar with. Ed Lansdale was a captain in the U.S. Army, and he became familiar with the existence of all of this loot as he was in the Philippines as a U.S. Army intelligence officer. He then went to General MacArthur and briefed him on all of this loot existing in the Philippines. MacArthur then sent him to President Truman directly to brief President Truman. So this is a very important point, because President Truman at this juncture decides to proceed with the recovery of all of this Axis loot and to keep it top secret. In other words, we're not going to return it to any claimants that the Japanese may have stolen it from. We're going to use it as a system of finance to fund covert projects and black research projects. And this was a decision he took in 1947, and he turned all of this over to the National Security Council. And it's very important for people here to understand what this means, because the amount of loot that was ultimately made available is probably in the billions of dollars. We don't know exactly how much there was. And this means that he's putting the intelligence agencies directly into the banking business. And this, of course, means that it's going to require the participation of certain prime banks in this system. But what you've effectively done is you've set up a hidden slush fund without any oversight whatsoever from Congress or anybody else to fund all of these black projects, to fund all of these covert operations. Now, as I've put it in other interviews that I've given on this topic over the years, there's another aspect of this that this means, and this means that you're going at some point to have the cooperation of the former Axis elites themselves in order to find all of this money, recover it, and make use of it. So there quite literally is a Faustian deal with the devil, if you will, towards the end of World War II that's made to put into place this operation. And we've seen other indications that there's something like this hidden system of finance in existence. And the details, we can go into the details if you want to, but I'm one of these people that can talk forever if you let me, so I'll shut up.
No, I appreciate it. This is great. And Joseph, there's so many things that I see today when you look at all the different symbols and sigils that are out there. A lot of them relate to what was around in the Nazi times, and it just seems like we're more of Rome. We take all the good from these. When I say we, I'm referring to America. It takes the great stuff from all these different cultures and brings it into its own and kind of adopts it. But, there's a lot of speculation that some of these flying saucers that people saw in the 40s and such were actually from Nazi technology and not extraterrestrials. What's your information on the Nazi tech that they had even back in the 30s, and where did they get it?
Well, this is a question I get asked a lot, and it's such a huge story. I've written probably close to a dozen books by now that touch in one way or another on this aspect of Nazi technology. And the reason for so many books, folks, is that it's such a huge story. There's so much misinformation out there. The details of the story, once you get into it, are so fantastic that if I were to write it up as a Hollywood B movie, people would easily dismiss it as fiction. And this is the reason I insist on footnoting things and arguing very carefully off the evidence, because it is a fantastic story. The Nazis, in my opinion, you hear all of these stories on the internet about the Haunebu flying saucer, the Vril flying saucer, and so on and so forth. There's a group of people out there that think that the Nazis actually achieved some sort of field propulsion or anti-gravity flying saucer. I am not in that crowd. Let me make that very clear. And the reason why is that most of these stories are coming out of a narrow circle of people again, this post-war Nazi international, that were clustered in and around Vienna, Austria, and Munich, Germany after the war. And they would publish photographs and so on, alleged plans and so on of these devices. The reality is that the Nazis were working on an exotic technology like this. And I've gone at great lengths in my books on the story of the so-called Nazi bell. This is the story that basically formed the centerpiece of the Jane's Defense Weekly journalist Nick Cook's book called The Hunt for Zero Point that appeared right around the turn of the millennium. It was a bestseller, incidentally. If you don't know the book, I highly recommend you read it. I kind of take off from him. He takes off from another researcher by the name of Igor Witkowski that first broke this story in Poland after the downfall of the Warsaw Pact and the demise of the Iron Curtain by going in and examining old documents, stories, interviewing witnesses, and installations in the former eastern zone of Germany. Essentially, what the Nazis were working on with this device, with this technology, I think was threefold. They were, first of all, looking for a form of what we would now call free energy or zero-point energy or what have you. The second thing they were working on is obviously if you have a technology that can access by some means the energy of the vacuum flux or the zero-point energy, if you can successfully learn how to manipulate that flux through a technological means, then the potential exists for you to have an anti-gravity technology, to be sure. And then the third thing, of course, is that if you have a technology that allows you to manipulate the vacuum flux or the fabric of space-time, whatever you want to call it, on the laboratory bench, then this ultimately has a weaponization potential that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So, the Nazis being Nazis, they're going to research all of this stuff. So they're essentially creating a technology, I think, with this Bell device that is a gateway technology. They're experimenting on whether or not it is possible to do this, number one. And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the answers from Witkowski's research, if you accept them for the sake of argument, is that